The shop is empty. 6 o'clock. The door is locked. The amber light holds just the two of them. She takes off the apron, hangs it on the hook, steps out from behind the bar. She sits across from me, not adjacent, across. Like she is done with the managed version of this. She says something that has no professional container, something she has held since October. 5 months of careful silence breaking open in one long, specific sentence, and her gray eyes do not flinch. Then she stands. She comes around the table. She stops in front of me. She says, "I want this." Her hand finds my jaw, and I understand what she has been building toward. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. 3 weeks earlier, I had found Meridian by accident. Not by accident in the romantic sense, nothing about me that morning was romantic. I was late for a pitch meeting with an editor who had already moved it twice, and the October rain was doing the aggressive, personal thing it does in this city when autumn finally commits. And the cafe I usually went to on Carver Street had a queue visible through the glass from half a block away. I turned right instead of left. I walked 30 seconds. I pushed open a door with a brass handle that had been polished until it was almost warm to the touch, and I walked into a room that stopped me in the entrance, the way only a few rooms have ever stopped me. Not because it was beautiful, exactly, but because it was correct. Proportioned in a way I could feel before I could identify. Long and narrow with exposed brick on one side and pale plaster on the other. Low-hanging pendant lights in brushed copper that cast everything amber even at 8 in the morning. A small bar at the back where the espresso machine sat like the room had been arranged around it. A tall machine in brushed graphite with 2 group heads and a steam wand that hissed twice while I stood there. The smell was dark roast and cedar, and something sweet underneath both. I did not immediately register the woman behind the bar, which I mention because I register people. It is professionally required of me and personally hardwired. And in 10 years of working in words about the world, I have walked into very few rooms without clocking who was in them before I clocked the room itself. The room got there first, which told me something about how much deliberateness had gone into building it. Then I looked at the bar. She was tall enough that the bar height looked designed around her, not the other way around. Dark hair pulled back at the nape of her neck in a low, clean pin. A long white apron over dark trousers. The kind of apron that should read as utilitarian, and instead read as intentional. Her hands were moving over the portafilter with the unhurried focus of someone who had done this 10,000 times and was choosing each time to do it well rather than merely quickly. She did not look up when the door opened. She did not look up when I came to stand in line. She went on working with the concentrated quality that certain people bring to tasks they have decided are worth doing properly. There were 2 people ahead of me. She handled them with the efficiency of a coffee shop that had been designed around one person's idea of what a coffee shop should be. Precise questions, zero wasted language. The order called to the younger barista at the secondary station in the clean relay of someone who trusts her team and has organized her trust well. She did not smile at either customer. She was not unkind. She was simply not performing warmth she had not felt, which in a service environment was rare enough to be its own kind of statement. When I got to the counter, she looked up. I said a cortado. She said the size. I said the size. She said a name. I gave her one. She looked at me for 1 second longer than she had looked at either of the people ahead of me. 1 second is a measurement with a specific weight in a queue. I registered the weight and told myself I was projecting. She went to the machine. I went to the pickup counter to wait. The cortado, when it came, was the best one I had ever had in this city. I drank it standing because I had no time to sit, and the pitch meeting was in 11 minutes, and the rain was still doing its thing outside. I left a tip that was probably too much, and went out the door and made the meeting by 40 seconds. I went back the next morning. I told myself it was the coffee. It was partly the coffee. By the end of the first week, I knew the following things about the room, which I now understood was called Meridian. The name was etched in small letters on the brass panel at the top of the front door, and below it, smaller still, Croft Proprietor. A woman who had put her own name on the door in the second smallest legible font available, was a specific kind of person. I had spent enough of my professional life around specific kinds of people to find the specificity worth paying attention to. She opened the shop every morning at 7 and was behind the bar until noon, at which point a shorter woman named Mira took over the primary station. Mira was warm, quick, the kind of professional warmth that comes from someone who genuinely likes people rather than someone performing the affect. On the afternoons Inez came back to the bar. The energy of the room was different in ways I was still trying to quantify. She took her own coffee, black, in a small glass, standing, in 2 or 3 sips between orders, not enjoying, refueling. She moved through the narrow space behind the bar with the economy of someone who had mapped every inch of it in advance and needed no surplus motion to navigate. Every movement had a destination. She was not warm. She was not cold in the way that reads as hostility. She was cold in the way that reads as a deliberate allocation of energy, this much to the work, this much to the customer interaction required by the work, nothing left over for performance of anything she hadn't actually felt. As a form of integrity, maybe. As a woman who had decided the world did not require her to be more than she actually was at any given moment, and who had organized her professional life around that decision. The younger barista, Mira, was everything Inez wasn't, and made the shop function better for it warm, attentive, the kind of presence that learned names and remembered preferences, and understood that a coffee shop is also a neighborhood. Inez ran everything underneath that, the sourcing, the ratios, the machine calibration, the flow of the room itself. She was the architecture and Mira was the light. I came back every morning. On the 11th day, Inez said my name for the first time. Not at the counter, not calling an order. She had made the cortado, set it on the pickup counter, and then held it for a half-second before releasing it. I took the glass. She looked at it. She said, "I changed the ratio this morning. Tell me what you think." I looked at her. She was looking at the glass with the same evaluating attention she brought to everything. I said, "Tell you now?" She said, "After you've tasted it, I drank." The ratio was different, a tighter pull, more concentrated, the bitterness lifting into something sharper before resolving sweeter. Better was the wrong word, more honest was closer. I said, "It's better." She nodded once, a single clean nod. She took my money and turned back to the machine. "Tavi," she said, under her breath, the way people say a name when they're filing it somewhere it will hold. I left the shop and walked 2 blocks and then stopped on the pavement and stayed there for 30 seconds, in the cold, understanding that I had spent 11 mornings telling myself this was about a cortado. By the end of the second week, the pattern had settled into its own grammar. I came in at 8, occasionally 8:15. Inez always knew the order. She occasionally asked a follow-up question about the previous day's coffee in a way that was technically calibration and practically something else, always about a particular element, the acidity or the temperature or the way the milk had integrated. But there were the small things. The angle of her attention was different with me than with other customers, not dramatically, but she looked for a half-second longer before returning to the machine. When I asked a question, she answered it directly. When other people took longer to decide, her attention drifted fractionally. When I took longer, she waited, fully, without the drift. I told myself this was how she treated any consistent regular. I told myself that for 9 more days, and then Clem walked through the door. Clementine Park, my best friend since we were both 22 and first-year journalists at the same paper, came in on a Thursday morning. I had told her about the coffee, not about anything else. She walked through the door at 8:30 and came to stand beside me in line and surveyed the room with the quiet attention of a woman who had spent a decade accurately reading everything she looked at. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Oh." I said, "What?" She tilted her head, very slightly, toward the bar. I said, "Clem." She said, "I'm just saying, oh." I said, "Nothing is happening." She picked up a menu card from the holder at the side of the queue and read it with the focused attention of someone who was not reading it at all. She said, "She's looked at you twice since we got in line." I said. She looks at all the customers, Clem said. She looked at the man ahead of us once and then looked at her watch. I said, she's efficient. She's selective, Clem said, and put the menu card down. We got to the counter. Ines looked at me, then at Clem, then back at me. The usual? She said. Yes, I said. She looked at Clem with the flat, patient attention she used on customers she had not yet categorized. Clem ordered a filter coffee. Ines called it to Mira and looked back at me. She's with you? She asked. I felt Clem absolutely detonate with silent laughter approximately 3 inches to my left. My friend, I said. She was curious about the coffee. Ines nodded, turned back to the machine. I paid. We moved to the pickup counter. Clem kept her face arranged until we were out of range, and then she turned to me with the expression she wore when she knew something and was deciding how generous to be about it. She said, "She asked if I was with you." I said, "It's a small shop. She manages the space." "Tavi," Clem said. I said, "I know." "She watched you from the machine for 11 seconds, Clem said. I counted. "I do not count things by accident," I said. "I know." Clem took her filter coffee from Mira with a genuine, warm smile and waited until we were seated at the window table before she said anything else. She said, "What are you going to do about it?" I said, "Nothing is happening." She said, "You're coming here every day and your usual place on Carver is 6 minutes shorter." I said, "The coffee is excellent." Clem looked at me over the rim of the cup in the way she had looked at me over the rim of various cups for 6 years, while waiting for me to finish lying to both of us. She said, "It is excellent coffee. And the woman making it is looking at you the way people look at things they've decided they are not allowed to want. And you are looking at her the way you look at a story you're not sure you have the right to write yet?" I did not say anything. She said, "I'm not telling you to do something about it. I'm noting that the thing exists. It exists, Tavi. It is in this room. It is very much in this room." We finished our coffee. Ines did not look at us again in any way a third party would have caught, which was different from not looking. Clem noticed the difference. I could see her noticing it. When we left, she touched my arm briefly on the way out the door. "Good coffee," she said. "I'll be back." I came back the next morning, and the morning after that. The thing that I was trying not to name had a shape by now, even if it didn't yet have language, the shape of a woman who made coffee for 40 different people every morning and made it differently for one. Not always. Not in any way I could document cleanly. But in the way the cortado occasionally arrived tighter, in the way the cup was sometimes marginally warmer when she handed it over, as though she had held it for a beat longer before the handoff. It had a sound too, the specific pause before she said my name at the counter. Not a hesitation. A pause. The moment before something deliberate. She said my name the way people say a word they are being careful not to waste. And then there was the morning, with the long line. It was a Monday and Mira was late and Ines was alone at the bar managing the full morning rush. I stood in line for 12 minutes. The line moved slowly. I stayed. When I got to the counter, she looked at me. She said, "You stayed." Observationally, factually, the way she stated everything. I said, "The coffee is worth it." She said, "Yes." She made the cortado. She brought it to the pickup counter. She set it down and did not immediately release it her hand near the cup. For the duration of the handoff, the warmth of the glass, the warmth of both the coffee and the proximity, it lasted 1 second. It still registered in my pulse. I took the cup. She turned to the next order. I went to the window table and sat with the cortado and I stopped pretending. The morning the money thing happened, I had been coming to Meridian for 18 days. I came in at 7:40, before the first wave of commuters. There were 2 people ahead of me in a queue that would have been 8 by 8:15. The room was in its early morning quiet, the machine still warming to full register, the acoustic of the space more intimate at this hour, the ambient sound of the street outside not yet audible through the glass. Ines was at the bar in a dark indigo apron instead of the usual white. The variation was small enough that most people would not have noticed it. I noticed it immediately and understood from my own reaction that I had been cataloging her appearance with a specificity that did not belong to casual observation. The indigo made the gray of her eyes different, darker, steadier, and the whole picture more deliberate. She took the two customers ahead of me with the same level attention. The modified latte order called to Mira in the exact same tone as the uncomplicated one. I stepped up. I said, "Cortado." She opened her mouth to respond, and stopped. The money was in my hand. I'd had it ready since I got in line, which I always did because efficiency at the counter felt like the minimum courtesy owed to everyone in the queue behind me. She did not take the money. She did not look at the money. She looked at me. The moment lasted between 3 and 6 seconds. In a coffee shop transaction, that is a geological age. Long enough for the woman behind me to shift her weight with the particular patience of someone who was pretending they hadn't noticed something. Long enough for Mira, who was behind the secondary station, to go very deliberately still in the way that requires effort to maintain. Ines blinked. She took the money. She said nothing. She went to the machine. I moved to the pickup counter. I stood there. She made the cortado. She brought it over. She set it down with more precision than usual, the small glass placed in the exact center of the ceramic saucer, deliberate in a way the placement always was, but this time visible as deliberateness. She did not look at me when she set it down. I said, "You forgot the money the first time." She said, "I didn't forget." I looked at her. She picked up the next order ticket and turned to the machine. I took my cortado to the window table and sat with it and thought about the difference between forgetting and stopping. About the 7 words she had just said, about what it meant to name the thing you had done as something other than an accident when someone gave you the easy exit of calling it one. I didn't forget. She had been deliberate. She had looked and stopped and chosen not to pretend it was an error. And then she had moved on with total efficiency and left me holding the named thing in a crowded room with nowhere to put it. I understood what she was doing. Ainscroft communicated in precision in the gap between what she said and what she didn't say, in the way a door left fractionally open was, for her, a more honest statement than a full sentence spoken into the wrong air. She had opened a door. I stayed for 45 minutes. I opened my laptop. I wrote 4 sentences and deleted 3. At some point in the late morning lull, when the queue had thinned to 2 lingering regulars, Inez came out from behind the bar with a cloth and began the maintenance circuit, wiping down the side tables, straightening the chairs, the kind of between-rush work that kept the room as deliberate as its design intended. She came to my table last. She wiped the surface adjacent to my laptop. She stood at the edge of my table and looked at my screen with the particular attention she brought to things she was deciding whether to comment on. "Working?" she said. "Journalism," I said. "Freelance. On what?" I looked up at her. She was close enough that the cedar and espresso smell of the bar had traveled with her into the room, faint but specific. The kind of scent detail you only register if you have been paying a particular kind of attention to a particular person. Her face was composed. She had asked a follow-up question that was not required by any professional obligation. "A piece on coffee importers," I said. "The supply chain between East African farms and specialty roasters." Her eyebrow moved. "A millimeter. Maybe less." "That's specific," she said. "Your coffee is Kenyan," I said. "Single origin. The card on the bar says Nyeri County. That's Batian or SL28 varietal. Typically. The extraction on your cortados suggests you're pulling tight to manage the natural acidity. That's a considered choice, which means you either have a specific importer with a point of view about sourcing or a direct farm relationship." A pause. She had the stillness of someone who had just been accurately read and was deciding how to respond to accuracy rather than to the form of the assessment. "Importer out of Portland," she said. "But I've been in direct contact with the farm for 2 years. That's the piece I'm trying to write," I said. "The mid-level relationship. The shop and the source, below the roaster." She said, "You've been drinking my coffee for 3 weeks and you didn't ask before now." I said, "I wasn't here to work. The pause that followed was different from her usual pauses. It was not the pause before something deliberate. It was the pause of someone revising what they thought they had understood. She picked up the cloth. She said, "I'll be doing closing inventory at 3 if you want to talk about the importer." She walked back to the bar. I came back at 3. Meridian at 3 was a different room than Meridian at 8. The light shifted entirely by mid-afternoon. The pendant lamps doing all the work now, amber, warmer, and more private than the morning diffusion. The street noise quieted to a mid-afternoon murmur. Mira was stacking chairs near the door. One last customer was nursing the cold end of a pour-over at the far bench. Ines was at the bar with a physical ledger and an invoice from the importer, cross-referencing against figures on a tablet. She had taken her apron off. She was in the dark trousers and a gray silk shirt that looked like it belonged to a different version of her life than the one behind the bar, quieter and more deliberate. The kind of shirt that comes from a wardrobe assembled over years with a specific eye. Her hair was still pinned. She had not looked up when I came in. "Close the door behind you," she said. I closed the door. I sat at the nearest table to the bar. The last customer finished the pour-over and left. Mira went out with a brief, speculative look in my direction that she arranged her face to neutralize approximately 1 second too late. Then it was just the two of us, and the afternoon light, and the faint hiss of the cooling machine. She talked about the importer for 20 minutes with the focused specificity of someone who had built every relationship in her supply chain as deliberately as she had built the room around us. She knew the farm manager's name. She knew which processing method she requested on the lots she bought, and why. She talked about acidity curves the way an architect might talk about structural requirements, not proudly, simply, with the complete assurance of someone who understood what they were doing at every level. I took notes. I asked questions. She answered without hedging, the same flat directness she brought to everything. At some point, she came out from behind the counter and sat at the adjacent table, not across from me. Adjacent, angled enough to feel like a meeting, and close enough that the space between us required awareness instead of furniture to manage it. She said, "You came back at 3. I said, "I came for the importer conversation." She looked at me, the gray eyes steady. Not assessing past assessment, sitting inside something she had already decided. She said, "Ask me the question you actually came back to ask." I set my pen down. She held my gaze. I said, "You said you didn't forget." "Yes," she said. I said, "What were you doing instead?" A silence. The cooling machine. The last of the amber light from the pendants. She said, "Looking." I said, "At what?" A longer silence. She said, "You know what? I did know. I had known it since the money moment, since the pause of it, since the 7 words spoken into the ordinary noise of a coffee shop like a door opened in a room with an audience. Ina's Croft communicated in precision, and the precision of not forgetting was its own full sentence. I said, "What do you do with that?" She said, "I don't know yet." I said, "That's honest." She said, "I try to be." I looked at her across the table in the afternoon quiet of a room she had designed and built and organized around the specific things she needed. I thought about the 18 mornings of cortados and precise adjustments and Clem's 11-second count and the pause before my name in the morning like she was making sure she meant it. I said, "I'll come back tomorrow." She said, "I know." She stood. She moved to the bar in the way she always moved, economical, purposeful, nothing wasted, but at the edge of the counter she stopped. She put one hand flat on the surface. She said, "The importer's name is Delacroix. First name is Lena. Portland-based. She's agreed to 2 interviews in 4 years. Tell her I sent you." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Good piece." I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you don't write badly. I read your byline." I stood up. I picked up my bag. I stopped at the door. I said, "When did you read my byline?" She said, "Week 2. I went out. I stood on the pavement outside Meridian, with the October evening coming in cold from the west, and the brass door handle warm at my back from the inside heat, and thought about week 2. about the fact that at the exact point I was telling myself the cortado was the reason I kept coming back, she had been learning enough about me to connect a byline to a name to the woman standing at her counter every morning. I went home. I wrote 600 words of the importer piece. I deleted 300. I kept 3. I thought about "I don't know yet," the way she had said it without apology, without deflection, with the honesty of someone who did not perform certainties they had not arrived at. A woman who built things carefully, did not pretend to know the end of a thing before she had built it properly. I came back in the morning. Over the following week, the pattern clarified into something I could no longer call observation. I came in at 8. The transaction always included something beyond the transaction, a question about the previous day's coffee, an adjustment made overnight. Sometimes just my name said in the particular way she said it, like something she was careful not to waste. I worked on the importer piece. Delacroix had agreed to talk and had been, exactly as Inez predicted, better than most people I interviewed, specific, opinionated, full of information she didn't offer, but would give if you asked the right question. The piece was writing itself in a way that good pieces write themselves, where the research has been thorough enough that the shape appears without having to be forced. I told Inez how the Delacroix interview had gone on a Wednesday morning. She said, "That's what happens when the sourcing is right," and turned to the next order. The incident with Dory happened in the 3rd week of November. Dory was a regular, always arriving just after 9, always with the same pour-over order, always spending a few minutes more at the bar than the transaction required. Warm at the counter in a way that was legible. On a Thursday, she came in just after I arrived. She positioned herself at the bar with her elbows on the counter and said something I couldn't hear from the window table. Inez said something back, brief. Dory laughed, touched the bar surface with her fingertips. Inez made the pour-over with full efficiency and closed the transaction. I was looking at my laptop screen the entire time. This was not the same as not watching. Later, during the between-rush lull, Inez came to my table for the maintenance circuit. She wiped the adjacent surface. She stood at the edge of my table and looked at me with the directness that did not adjust itself for convenience. She said, "You're doing the thing where you're watching something without looking at it," I said. "I was working," she said. "You've written 40 words in the last hour," I said. "It's a slow passage," she said. The pour-over is her regular order. She comes in on Thursdays. There's nothing there. In case the slow passage is connected to anything in this room. I looked up at her. She held my gaze steadily. I said, "Were you telling me because you thought I needed to know, or because you wanted to say it?" A pause. She said, "Both." She picked up the cloth and moved to the next table. I looked at my screen for a long time. The cursor blinked. I had written 40 words in an hour, and none of them were about the importer. "Both," said like a statement of fact, like she had accounted for both components of the answer and was not going to pretend to only one of them. I filed the importer piece the following week. My editor called it clean and specific and said the texture of the sourcing relationships was unusually intimate for a trade piece, which was his way of saying it had been written by someone paying close attention to something they found genuinely interesting. He asked if I had a second piece in the same territory. I said I was working on one. I printed a copy of the piece. I left it on the bar at Meridian on a Tuesday morning without saying anything about it. Inez looked at it, then at me. She said nothing. On Thursday, she said, "The line about trust, built in person." That was right. I said, "Which line?" She said, "The one where you wrote that the best supply chains aren't about efficiency. They're about trust that has to be made face to face." I said, "You could have said that about this shop." She said, "I know." I said, "Is that why you liked it?" She held my gaze. She said, "Yes." A customer behind me cleared her throat gently. Inez turned to her. The morning continued. By early December, I had settled into a pattern that was no longer pretending to be about journalism. The second piece gave me a professional frame, but the professional frame was a courtesy at this point, a shared fiction we were both maintaining without discussing its maintenance. I came in every morning. I stayed longer than I used to. 3 times a week I came back at 3, and we sat at the adjacent tables and talked about coffee and supply chains and the specific economics of sourcing relationships until we were talking about something else. And then we kept talking. She told me about the architecture on a Wednesday in the 4th week of November. I had asked about the photograph on the shelf behind the bar. A building. Clean lines. A specific quality of light in the way it was framed that suggested the photographer understood what they were looking at. She said, "I designed that." I said, "You're an architect." Was, she said. 8 years. The firm is still in the city. I said, "Why did you leave?" She was quiet for a moment. The particular stillness of someone deciding how much of an honest answer the question deserved, she said, "I was very good at it. And I was spending 10 hours a day doing something I was very good at, and going home afterward to an apartment that felt like a waiting room. And then one morning, I stopped in a coffee shop on the way to a site visit, and the person at the bar made me an espresso without being asked, and it was the best thing that had happened to me in months. And I thought about that for 6 weeks, and then I quit." I said, "And now you make coffee for people." She said, "Now I make coffee for people. And I designed the room they drink it in. And the room is right." I said, "Is that enough?" She said, "Most days." I said, "Which days isn't it?" She turned from the photograph. Her eyes found me with the directness she brought to everything she decided was worth looking at directly. She said, "The ones where I want something I haven't figured out how to want yet." The room was quiet. The afternoon light was doing what it did in Meridian at 3 o'clock, which was make everything feel more specific than it had been a moment before. I said, "You figured out the coffee." She said, "The coffee was easier. The coffee didn't look back." I absorbed that. She stood. She went behind the bar. She began cleaning the steam wand with the careful precision she brought to every task that required her hands and gave her something to do with her attention that wasn't the middle of the room. I packed my notes. I said, "I'll come back tomorrow." She said, "I know." The morning she told me about the week 2 byline was, I understood later, the morning she had decided something. Not what to do with it yet, just that the thing was real enough to be honest about. And the morning she fed me the bread the week after the Dory incident, when I'd come in late after a missed deadline and forgotten to eat, was something else entirely. She had not asked. She had not announced it. She had called something to Mira in a tone I couldn't hear over the machine noise, and Mira had appeared at the pickup counter with a piece of the dark grain bread they kept for staff and set it beside my cortado with the careful neutrality of someone who had been instructed not to make it into a thing. Mira came back for the plate when I finished. She was smiling in a way she was not quite managing to suppress. "She doesn't do that," Mira said, collecting the plate. "I gathered," I said. Mira said, "For anyone. In 3 years." She went back to the bar. I looked at Inez. She was at the machine. She was not looking at me. She was not looking with the particular quality of someone who knows exactly where something is without turning toward it. I stayed for 2 hours. I did not write much. The conversation happened on a Wednesday in the 1st week of December. We were at the adjacent tables at 3, the shop emptied and the afternoon amber doing its work, and she had been talking about the spring sourcing trip to the farm in Kenya, what she wanted to see, what she wanted to ask. The specific things you can only understand when you have stood in the place where the thing you care about comes from. I had been listening with the quality of attention I brought to things I found genuinely important. Then she said, "What do you do when you want something you can't have neatly?" She was looking at the photograph, the building, the life she had been very good at and had left behind when she found something she needed more. I said, "Say what I mean and let the mess be the mess." She said, "That's not an easy approach." I said, "Nothing about it is easy, but the alternative is managing something until it breaks in the wrong direction, instead of handling it while it can still be handled honestly." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'm not good at letting things be messy." I said, "You're good at being honest. That's the more important one." She looked at me. Something in her face that was usually fully composed moved once, briefly, like the surface of still water when something passes underneath it. She said, "I read your second piece before you filed it." I said, "You weren't on the review list." She said, "You emailed me to check the Meridian section for accuracy." I said, "That was the professional reason." She said, "Yes." I said, "What did you think of it?" She said, "It's better than the first one. The first one was good. The second one knows something the first one didn't." I said, "What does it know?" She said, "That the relationships are the story, not the product. The trust built between the people is the story. The coffee is just how you can tell the trust is real." I said, "That's what I figured out." She said, "When?" I said, "Third week." She looked at me. A long moment. The specific amber of Meridian at 3 o'clock in December, when the afternoon light was lower and more direct and made the room feel both smaller and more honest. She said, "Tavi." It was the first time she had said my name outside the frame of a transaction. Not at the counter. Not calling an order. Just my name, in the afternoon quiet, like it was the word she had finally found the right moment to use. I said, "Yes." She said, "I don't know how to do this without making it into something it shouldn't be yet." I said, "Then don't make it into anything yet. Just say the part that's true right now." She looked at her hands, then at me. She said, "The part that's true right now is that you are the most specifically interesting person who has come through that door in 3 years. And that I looked at you in week 2 to understand why I was adjusting your cortado. And that I understood it when I found your byline, and that understanding has not simplified anything." I said, "That's the most words you've said to me at once." She said, "I know." I said, "It was worth waiting for." She stood. She moved to the bar. At the edge of the counter, she stopped and turned back, one hand resting on the surface. She said, "Come back tomorrow." I said, "I come back every day." She said, "Come back tomorrow and don't make it about the piece." I said, "What should I make it about?" She held my gaze from across the room, from behind her bar, in her room, with her name on the door. She said, "Whatever the part is that comes after figuring out the relationships are the story." I went home. I sat on my kitchen floor with a glass of wine and thought about the architecture degree framed nowhere, and the photograph of the building she had left behind, and the way she had said, "I don't know yet," like it was a promise rather than a deflection. I thought about the coffee she'd made me on the morning I was late with no food in me, and the way Mira had said in 3 years with the voice of someone testifying to something they'd seen and couldn't explain. I thought about week 2 and the byline search in both, that one word spoken cleanly when she could have given me only one half of the answer. I thought, there is a woman who built a whole room around the thing she needed and is sitting inside it trying to figure out how to want the one thing the room didn't account for. I am going to be patient and honest and let her arrive at this the way that she arrives at everything carefully, deliberately, with her whole attention. It is going to be worth it in the specific way that things are worth it when you have waited for them to be real rather than just possible. I finished the wine. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning I came in at 7:50. Not 8. 7:50, which was early enough that the shop had the particular quality of a room that has been opened and prepared but not yet inhabited by the full weight of the day. Inez was at the bar. She looked up when I came in. I said, "You said not to make it about the piece." She said, "Yes." I said, "So I'm not." She made the cortado without asking. She brought it to the pickup counter, and this time she did look at me directly, levelly, with the gray eyes that cataloged everything. She said, "Sit somewhere comfortable. The rush starts at 8:15. I sat at the window table. I did not open my laptop. When she brought the second cortado to the table herself instead of leaving it at the pickup counter, I understood from the act that something had shifted overnight. When the rush thinned, she came to stand at the edge of my table, not for the maintenance circuit. She just stood and looked at me with the level attention I had come to understand as its own form of conversation. She said, "You came early." I said, "I didn't want to make it about the piece." She said, "It's clear." She stayed at the edge of the table for a moment longer than necessary. Then she went back to the bar. I left at 10. At the door, I looked back. She was at the machine. She was looking at the bar, not at me. But the angle of her shoulders was the angle of someone who knows exactly where something is without turning toward it. I filed the pitch for the second piece and told my editor the second piece would need 8 weeks. He said, "Take your time with this one." December moved the way Decembers move, in this city gray and dense, with a cold that had personality rather than just temperature. I came to Meridian every morning. The pattern continued, but the frame around it had changed, the way a room changes when you've finally acknowledged what it's for. Neither of us had explicitly named the thing, but we were done pretending, and the done pretending had its own texture. She started coming to the window table without the cloth, some mornings standing in the 9 o'clock lull, cup of black coffee in hand, looking at the street with me. She did not explain these visits. I did not ask her to. They lasted between 2 and 4 minutes and were the most intimate thing that had happened between us. The question she asked on the 4th Thursday of December was not the question I expected. She had come to the table at 9:15, cup in hand, and we had been looking at the street when she said, "What does the second piece need that you haven't gotten yet?" I said, "I'm not here about the second piece." She said, "I know. I'm asking anyway," I said. "It needs someone who made the decision to go direct, to cut out the middle layer. I have the importer side and the farm side. I need the shop owner who decided the relationship was worth the complexity." She said, "That's me." I said, "I know." She said, "What does that interview require?" I said, "More time than a 3 o'clock. Probably somewhere that isn't here, so you can talk about it from the outside rather than from inside it." She was quiet for a moment. The street was doing the Thursday morning thing, the particular mix of commuters and people with no urgency who had chosen the middle of the week for their errands. She said, "I know a place." She named a restaurant 2 neighborhoods over. Not coffee, dinner. The way she said dinner was straightforward, in the same flat tone she used for everything, and I understood it to be offered as exactly what it was, and also as something else entirely. I said, "When?" She said, "Saturday." I said, "Saturday." She went back to the bar. I looked out at the street for a long time after she left the table. Saturday was not a 3 o'clock in Meridian. Saturday was not Ines with her hair pinned and her apron on, in the room she had built around her specific needs, talking about supply chains. Saturday was something else, and we both knew it, and neither of us had used a word that was not professionally defensible, which was the most honest thing that had happened between us yet, because the professional defense had worn through, and we were doing it anyway. Saturday was a restaurant in a neighborhood that neither of us worked in. She arrived before me. She was at a corner table with her hair down. I stopped in the doorway for 1 second. She saw me stop. The corner of her mouth moved, barely, in a way I had catalogued enough times to read. She looked at the table. I sat down across from her. For the first 20 minutes we talked about the piece. She was specific and illuminating about the direct sourcing decision, the way she was specific about everything she had chosen carefully. The risk, the complexity, the 2 years of relationship building before the first lot arrived. She talked about standing in the processing station at the farm and understanding, physically, what she was trying to do with the extraction ratios back home. She talked about it the way people talk about the things that matter most to them when they have stopped worrying about how they sound. I took notes on my phone. At some point I stopped. She noticed. She said, "You've stopped taking notes." I said, "I have what I need for the piece." She said, "Then what are you doing?" I said, "Listening to you talk about the thing you care most about in the world right now." She looked at me. In the restaurant light, with her hair down and no apron, and the gray silk shirt that I had last seen in Meridian at 3 o'clock, she looked more fully herself than she had in any of the professional contexts that had been the only contexts I had known her in. She said, "That's a presumptuous thing to say about someone's priorities." I said, "I know. Am I wrong?" A silence. She looked at her hands. She said, "No." I said, "Tell me about the morning you quit the firm." She looked up. I said, "Not the decision." I have the decision from October. Tell me about the morning. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought she might redirect it. Then she said, "It was a Tuesday. I had a 9 o'clock site meeting. The coffee shop was on the way, and the person at the bar, a woman, maybe 60, made the espresso before I asked for it. She handed it over and said, 'You look like you need this.' And I stood there, and I started crying. In a coffee shop. At 7:50 in the morning, I said, 'What did you do?' She said, 'I stood there for 40 seconds and then I pulled myself together and went to the site meeting.' And on the way I thought about what it meant that a stranger making me a cup of coffee was the kindest thing that had happened to me in months, and I thought about it for 6 weeks, and then I quit. I said, 'And you opened Meridian so you could be the one making the coffee,' she said, 'and so I could build the room around it,' I said, 'so that the kindness had the right container.' She looked at me. Something in her face that was usually composed opened slightly, the way a window opens to let in the right amount of air. She said, 'That's what the piece says, in different words.' I read it 3 times. I said, 'I wrote it about the room, but I think I was writing about you.' She held my gaze. She said, 'I think you were too.' We stayed for 2 hours. At some point, the conversation stopped being about coffee or architecture or supply chains and became about other things: her years in the firm, the specific loneliness of being very good at something that didn't leave room for the rest of you, what she had read the previous winter, what I had been trying to write before the importer piece redirected everything. We talked the way people talk when they have given up managing the conversation and are simply in it. When we left, she held the door. On the pavement outside the restaurant, the December air was cold enough to make every breath visible, and she stood with her hands in the pockets of her coat and looked at me with the gray eyes in the streetlight. She said, "That was good." I said, "Yes." She said, "The interview part and the other part." I said, "Yes." She looked at me for one moment longer. She said, "Good night, Tavi." I said, "Good night, Inez." We went in opposite directions. I walked 3 blocks before I allowed myself to think about her hair down, and the way she had said that was good, like it was a fact she was logging for later. I thought about it for a long time. January came, and the city contracted around the cold. I came to Meridian every morning. The pattern was the same and was entirely different. She said my name differently now, the pause before it, no longer the pause of calibration, but something that cost a small, specific amount every time she used it, and she was choosing to pay that cost every morning. I started staying until 10:30, then 11. She let me. She came to the window table twice a week on average, sometimes more, sometimes with the coffee and sometimes without. Mira navigated around these visits with the practiced grace of someone who had reorganized her entire understanding of her workplace over the previous months and was keeping her conclusions entirely to herself. One Thursday, Mira said, "I'm taking my break at 9, and went to the back, and Ines was alone at the bar for 40 minutes. I came up to the counter mid-morning for a glass of water, and she made it into a conversation that lasted 25 minutes about a specific detail in the second piece. At some point I realized I was leaning on the bar and she was standing on the other side of it, very close, close enough that I was aware of the warmth of her in that narrow space, and had stopped pretending that awareness was incidental. We had been talking for 25 minutes about 3 sentences in a journalism piece about coffee sourcing. She said, the sentence about proximity. About how the relationship only works if both parties accept the vulnerability of depending on each other. I said, "What about it?" She said, "It applies to things that aren't coffee." I said, "I know." She said, "I thought about it for a week." I said, "What did you think?" She looked at the bar surface, then at me. She said, "That it might be true." She went back to the machine. I went back to the window table. I wrote for the first time in 3 weeks with the particular focus that comes when the rest of your attention has been resolved into one clear point. The second piece filed in the 3rd week of January. My editor called it the best thing I had turned in 2 years. He asked if there was a 3rd piece. I said I was still determining that. I told Inez the piece had filed. She said, "I'll read it." I said she had already read it. She said, I'll read the version people read. On the Thursday after it ran, Mira told me, when Ines was in the back, that 4 people had come in specifically because of the article. I said, "How was Ines about that?" Mira said, "She was quiet. She made excellent coffee." When the last one left, she stood at the bar for a long time looking at the door. Then she looked at the window table. She said, "She's been looking at the window table a lot this winter." The question of the sourcing trip came up in early February. Inez had been planning it since November. The visit to the farm in Kenya that she talked about at 3 o'clock in the kind of terms that told you this was not a business trip with sightseeing attached, but a pilgrimage to the source of something she had built her whole professional life around. She had the dates. She had the itinerary. She had a local contact at the farm and a specific list of questions about the new processing method they were trialing. On a Tuesday morning, she said, "I'll be away for 2 weeks in March." I said, "The sourcing trip." She said, "Yes." I said, "When do you leave?" She said the date. It was 5 weeks away. I said, "Tell me what you want to understand when you get there." She told me, standing at the edge of my table with her coffee going cold, talking for 40 minutes about the processing method, the acidity profile, the bloom time, the altitude, and the varietal selection, and the specific quality of light in the Nyeri region in March that she had seen in photographs and wanted to see herself. She was more animated than I had ever seen her. Not dramatically, Inez did not do dramatic, but there was a warmth in her precision that was different from the winter warmth of the 3 o'clock conversations. The warmth of someone who had found that she wanted to share the things that organized her life with another person. I listened to all of it. At some point, Mira arrived, took one look at the scene. Inez at the edge of the window table. Coffee forgotten. Hands moving slightly, the way hands move when someone is thinking out loud, and went very quietly to the secondary station, and began her morning prep with a focus that was entirely too deliberate to be natural. When the 9 o'clock rush began, Ines went back to the bar. She handled the first 12 customers with complete efficiency. At some point, she looked at the window table. I was still there. I was not pretending to write. I was looking at her. She looked back for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at the next customer. It was the morning of the second week of February when the thing broke open. I came in at 8, and the shop was busier than usual. Inez was at the bar managing 4 things at once with the focused precision of someone who had planned for this and still found it at the edge of her range. When I got to the counter, she was finishing a sequenced steam wand, portafilter, the extraction timer. She finished and turned. She looked at me. And I saw it. Not the composure. The thing underneath the composure. The thing that had been there for months, that she had been managing and containing and refusing to perform, the thing she had said both about and I don't know yet about, and had been building toward with the precision she brought to everything she built. I saw it in the 3 seconds before she arranged her face for the transaction. 3 seconds of what it actually was. Unmanaged. Fully present. Looking at me from across a bar in a coffee shop on a Thursday morning in February. Then she said, "Cortado?" I said, "Yes." She made it. She brought it to the pickup counter. She set it down. I said, "I can see it." She said, "Tavi." I said, "I'm not going to make this difficult. I just need you to know I can see it." She held my gaze for a long moment. Behind me, the queue had reorganized itself, and Mira was handling it with quiet efficiency. There was the specific low noise of the morning rush, and the machine, and the ambient acoustic of the room. She said, "I know you can." I said, "Okay." I took my cortado. I went to the window table. She served the queue. She was efficient and complete, and gave no sign of the conversation that had just occurred. I sat with the cortado and did not pretend to do anything except sit there. At 9:30, when the rush had thinned, she came to the window table without the cloth. She stood at the edge. She did not sit. She looked at the street. She said, "I have been trying to be careful." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know what careful looks like from outside. I only know what it costs from inside." I said, From outside, it looks like someone who is paying an ongoing toll for a decision they made about a feeling they are not sure they have the right to. She was quiet. She said, "That's accurate." I said, "You have the right." She said nothing. I said, "I'm not going anywhere. I've been here every morning for months and I'm not going anywhere. You can take the time you need." She looked at me. Something in her expression was the most unguarded I had seen from her, yet not open, exactly, but undefended. The composure present not as armor but as foundation, holding her up rather than closing her in. She said, "I'm going to Kenya in 5 weeks." I said, "I know." She said, "When I come back, I would like to have a different conversation than the ones we have been able to have in here." I said, "How is it different?" She said, "It's in a room that isn't this room," with the full version of what I've been saying in pieces. I said, "I'll be here when you come back." She said, "I know." She went back to the bar. I sat at the window table for another hour. Mira, at some point, brought me a second coffee without being asked, and set it down and said nothing, and went back to her station. I drank it and looked at the street, and thought about 5 weeks and the full version, and what it would cost a woman like Inez Croft to pay it in full. I thought, worth it. I thought, I have known it was worth it, since the money moment, and possibly before. The 5 weeks were the kind that are both long and short depending on which detail you are tracking. Long because I came to Meridian every morning, and Ines was at the bar, and the thing between us had been named by neither of us completely, and the quality of her attention had shifted in a way I could feel, and could not prove to anyone else. Short because February became early March, and I was working well for the first time in years. The particular clarity that comes from having your attention fully organized around something that matters, and the days filled themselves. The last morning before she left for Kenya was a Sunday. The shop was closed on Sundays. I did not go in. She texted me at 7:15. The message said, "I leave at noon. There is coffee on the counter for you if you want it." I stood in my kitchen reading this for a long time. I went. The brass handle was cold. The door was unlocked. The shop was empty. Chairs not yet on the tables, the morning light coming in through the windows at the particular angle that happened before the city fully woke up, the pendants off and the room lit by the gray March sun instead of amber. Different. Quieter. Like seeing a face without its usual expression. She was at the bar in dark jeans and a coat, a travel bag by the door, making something at the machine with the focused attention she brought to everything regardless of context. She looked up when I came in. She said, "I wasn't sure you'd come." I said, "You weren't sure?" She said, "I was 80% sure." I said, "You left the door open for the 20%? She said, "I left the coffee on for the 80. She handed me the cortado. Made exactly right, in the small glass, temperature correct. I took it and leaned against the counter and drank it while she moved through the closing checklist, things that needed to be turned off. Systems that Mira would manage for 2 weeks and that Inez needed to know were in order before she could leave. I watched her move through the empty shop with the efficiency I had been watching for months. Methodical, thorough, moving through every corner as if memorizing it, or saying goodbye to it in the way people say goodbye to things they fully intend to return to, but need to mark the leaving of. When she had gone through everything, she stood at the bar and looked at me. She said, "The piece is good." I said, "You've said that." She said, "I keep saying it because it's accurate, and I think accuracy deserves repetition when something is genuinely true." I said, "What's the most accurate thing you haven't said yet?" She looked at me. From behind the bar, in the gray winter light, with no apron, and no amber, and no queue of customers, and no professional cover to stand behind. She said, "That I want to come back to a different version of this." I said, "This is a specific this." She said, "Yes." I said, "Say the specific." A pause. The length of a breath. She said, "I want to come back to a version where I am not standing behind this bar when I tell you what I should have said in October." I said, "What should you have said in October?" She looked at me for a long, very still moment. She said that I was adjusting your cortado because I was paying attention to you in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee, and that I read your byline to understand why, and that I understood why. I said, "And what's the why?" She said, "I think you know the why." I said, "I want to hear it from you." She came out from behind the bar, not quickly, deliberately. She crossed the room and stood in front of me, and we were close in the way that the space between the bar and the window table had never allowed. She said, "The why is that I have not wanted to know someone the way I want to know you since I was 30 years old." And I did not know what to do with that when it arrived in my shop wearing a coat and asking for a cortado. The room was quiet around us. The city outside had not yet fully woken up. The machine was cooling now instead of warming. I said, "You could have told me." She said, "I know." I said, "When you come back." She said, "When I come back." She looked at me for one more moment, and then she stepped back, one step, clean, deliberate, the step of someone who was not retreating but marking the place where the conversation paused, and she picked up her travel bag from by the door. She said, "The shop is yours until Mira opens Monday. Lock up when you go." I said, "You're leaving me in your shop." She said, "You know where everything is." I said, "Ines." She stopped at the door. I said, "Come back." She said, "That was never the question." She went out. I stood in Meridian alone in the gray March light, with a half-finished cortado and the specific quiet of a room that had been built by a person who understood what the right container for the right thing felt like. The machine was off. The chairs were on the tables. The brass handle had gone cold again in her absence. I sat at the window table. I finished the coffee. I looked at the street. I stayed for an hour. Then I locked the door behind me. 2 weeks are 2 weeks. They pass the way things pass when you are working and the work is good. Mira texted me midway through. She landed. The farm is what she expected. She asked how the window table is doing. I texted back, "The window table is fine. The cortados are good but not as good." Mira did not respond, which was its own response. I wrote a third piece during those 2 weeks, not the sourcing piece, something that had been sitting in my notes for months. I found the angle in the second week and wrote it in 4 days, the fastest I had written anything in years. My editor called it a very confident piece. I thought about confidence, about what it was made of. Ines came back on a Tuesday. I did not go to the shop Tuesday or Wednesday. I came in Thursday morning, 8 o'clock. The brass handle was cold and then warm. The door opened into cedar and dark roast. The light was amber. The machine was running at its proper register. Mira was at the secondary station. She looked up when I came in, and something in her expression shifted into the careful neutrality I had come to understand as her version of announcement. Ines was at the bar. She looked up. We looked at each other across the room. I got in line. I waited. When I got to the counter, she looked at me the way she had looked at me since October, except different now in the specific way that happens when two people have both stopped managing something at the same time. She said, "Cortado." I said, "Yes." She made it. She brought it to the pickup counter. She set it down and she did not let go immediately. Her hand near the cup, the warmth between us, 1 second. She said, "The farm is everything I thought it would be." I said, "Tell me." She said, "Not here." I said, "Tonight?" She said, "I close at 6. I said, "I'll be here at 6. I went to the window table. I stayed until 10. I watched her work and felt the specific warmth of two people who are done with the managed version of a thing and have finally arrived at the door of the honest one. At 6 o'clock, the last customer left, and Mira said goodnight, and the door clicked shut behind her. Ines finished the closing routine. She took off her apron and hung it on the hook, the deliberate motion she used every evening, the act of setting down the professional version for the day. She came out from behind the bar and sat across from me. Not adjacent, across, the March dark outside the glass and the amber light doing what it always did. She said, "The farm manager's name is Amara. She's been working that land for 20 years. She showed me the specific lot she's been holding back for 2 seasons, waiting for a buyer who understood what she was trying to do with the processing. I said, "And?" She said, "I'm buying the lot. It arrives in June. It's the best coffee I've tasted in my life." I said, "What made it right?" She said, "The processing respects what the varietal already is. It doesn't try to turn it into something it isn't. It creates the right conditions for the thing to be fully itself." She said this, and then she looked at me and let me hear what she had said. I said, "That's the piece." She said, "I know." I said, "That's also not about coffee." She said, "No." I said, "Say the version that's not about coffee." She was quiet for one long moment. The room breathed around us, the machine cooling, the city outside going about its Thursday evening. She said, "I have been trying to create the right conditions for something for 5 months, and I have been careful and deliberate about it the way I am careful and deliberate about everything I build. And I have been in Kenya for 2 weeks, standing in the light on a hillside in Nyeri, thinking about what it means to respect what something already is, and let it be that, rather than turning it into something manageable." I said, "What have you decided?" She said, "That I have been managing something that did not need to be managed, that needed to be let." I said, "Let what?" She looked at me. She said, "Let be what it is, without the container." I said, "What is it?" A silence that was not empty. That was full of everything that had been accumulated across the months, the 18 mornings before the money moment, and the months after it, and the Saturday dinner, and the 5 weeks before Kenya, and the 2 weeks of the farm, the Thursday that had finally come after. She said, "It is the most specifically interested I have been in another person in a long time, and it is wanting to know what you think about things I have not told anyone else. And it is watching you at the window table and understanding that the room I built was missing something until you were in it regularly. And it is." She stopped. I said, "And?" She said, "And it is wanting to be the person who makes your coffee for a long time, specifically, not as a service." I held her gaze. She said, "Is that?" I said, "Yes." She blinked. I said, "Whatever you were going to ask at the end of that sentence." "Yes." Something moved across her face that was the most unguarded I had ever seen from her. Not soft, Inez did not do soft as a category, but open, fully open. The composure present as the thing it actually was, which was not armor and not management, but the steadiness of a person who had arrived at the place they meant to arrive. She said, "I don't know how to do this. I'm good at building things and at being precise about what I want from materials. I am less practiced at." I said, "You don't have to be practiced. You just have to be honest." She said, "I am being honest." I said, "I know. That's all it takes." I said, "Can I tell you what I see?" She said, "Yes." I said, "I see someone who left behind everything they were professionally excellent at because it wasn't enough, who built a room around the things that were. Who runs that room with a kind of integrity I have not encountered in most people I have known professionally or personally. Who noticed a customer who came in off the rain, on a wrong turn in week 2, and spent 5 months trying to do the right thing about it, which is not nothing. Trying to do the right thing is an enormous thing. And who is sitting across from me right now, saying the honest version out loud, and calling it not knowing how. She was looking at me with the gray eyes that catalogued everything. I said, "You know exactly how. You've been doing it the whole time." Then she said, "I've wanted to tell you the full version since October." I said, "It's March." She said, "I know. I didn't want to drop it." I said, "You didn't drop it." She said, "No." I said, "Come around the table." She looked at me. I said, "Not the machine, not the bar, just here. Come around the table." She stood. She came around the table and stood in front of me, where the space between us was not managed by furniture or professional context, or the careful architecture of doing the right thing about a feeling. I said, "The full version." She said, I have wanted to know you completely since October. I want to keep making your coffee because I want to keep knowing you. I want to be the person you come back to. I want—" She stopped. I said, "What do you want?" She said, "This." She touched my jaw. One hand, careful. The way she touched things she was being precise about, not tentative, precise. Her palm warm against my face and her gray eyes level and honest and present in a way they had always been but were now not managing. I said, "Okay." She kissed me. It was not desperate. It was not frantic. It was the way she did everything with her full attention, with the economy that was not coldness but the opposite of coldness, which is focus. With the patience of someone who had been working toward this for months and was not going to rush the arrival just because it had finally come, patient, earned. The restraint of 5 months finally turning into something honest instead of withholding. Her hand stayed at my jaw the way she kept her grip on things she had decided mattered, unhurried, certain, warm. When she stepped back, her hand was still at my jaw, warm, and her face was the most open I had ever seen it, the composure present in its truest form, which was not management but simply her, settled and clear and here. She said, "I should have done that in October." I said, "You couldn't have done that in October. You weren't ready in October." She said, "No." I said, "This is the right time." She said, "Yes." I said, "Are you going to make me a cortado?" She looked at me. The corner of her mouth moved in the full version of the expression I had been cataloging for months, not the millimeter, the whole thing, unheld and real. She said, "It's 9 o'clock at night." I said, "You have the beans." She said, "The machine takes 15 minutes to warm." I said, "I'll wait." She went to the machine. She turned it on. She went through the warm-up with the focused precision she brought to everything she decided was worth doing properly. At some point, she reached up and took her hair down from the pin, without thinking about it, the way people do when they are in a place they are fully at home in, and did not seem to register the gesture even as I registered it for both of us. I watched her from the window table. The room was amber and quiet and correct. The city outside was doing its Thursday evening things. The machine built toward its proper register, the hiss of it becoming the familiar hiss of the room doing what the room did best, which was hold the things that belonged inside it. She made the cortado. She brought it to the window table. She sat across from me, not adjacent, across, so she could look at me directly, which she had always preferred, and folded her hands around her own coffee, and looked at me with the gray eyes that had been cataloging me since October. She said, "Tell me something you haven't told me yet." I said, "I deleted your number twice before I put it in under Meridian so I would stop second-guessing myself every time I thought about texting you." She said, "When?" I said, "December." She said, "I took your name off a sticky note on the register in November and then wrote it again the same afternoon, because looking at it was not helping me be careful about getting this wrong." I said, "You didn't." She said, "I know. We stayed in Meridian until 11 o'clock. The coffee cooled eventually, and neither of us moved to leave until we both did at the same time. The natural conclusion of a conversation that had been building since October and had finally arrived at a place where it could rest. At the door, she held it open. I passed through. On the pavement, she stood with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at me in the way she had looked at me since October, except that the thing underneath the look was not managed anymore, was not contained, was simply present and allowed to be. She said, "Saturday." I said, "Not the interview kind." She said, "Not the interview kind." I said, "The dinner kind." She said, "Yes." I said, "Good night, Inez." She said, "Good night, Tavi." She went one direction, I went the other. I walked to the corner and looked back, and she was still standing outside Meridian, looking after me, and when she saw me look back, she did not look away. She stood there, her name on the door behind her, and looked, and let me see her looking. I walked home through the March night thinking about October, and the rain and the wrong turn, and the brass handle warm even in the cold, and the cortado that was the best I had ever had, and the woman behind the bar who had looked at me 1 second longer than she needed to. I thought about all the ways that arriving somewhere by accident turns out not to have been an accident at all. In April, the lot from Amara's farm arrived early, a small advance shipment, the first of the holdback lot, processed exactly as Inez had requested. She texted me the morning it came in, and I was at Meridian before 9, and she made a cortado from the new lot and set it on the window table and sat across from me and said, "Tell me what you taste." I tasted it. It was extraordinary in the specific way that things are extraordinary when they have been approached with total honesty. The acidity, bright and specific, the sweetness coming up clean behind it, the whole thing organized around what the bean already was rather than what the roasting tried to make it. I said, "It's right." She said, "Yes." I said, "The processing respects what the varietal already is." She said, "It does." I said, "You found it." She said, "We found it." I looked at her across the window table in the morning amber of the room she had built, and she looked back at me with the gray eyes that had never stopped cataloging. And neither of us said the rest out loud because some things do not need to be said when the room is already full of them. The morning regulars came in. Mira arrived and took the secondary station and arranged her face into the careful neutrality she had been maintaining for months, which no longer fooled either of us. Inez went back to the bar. She made coffee for everyone who came through the door. She was precise and unhurried and completely present cold to the casual observer and something else entirely to the one who had been paying the right kind of attention long enough. At 9:30 she came to the window table without the cloth, coffee in hand, and looked at the street. I looked at the street. The city was doing what it did in April, something loosening, the light changing quality, the particular relief of a place emerging from a long winter into the first days of something that might hold. She said, "The third piece." I said, "What about it?" She said, "You should write it." I said, "About the lot?" She said, "About all of it. The importer, the farm, the direct relationship. What it takes to build something honest from source to cup." I said, "That's a very long piece." She said, "It's a very long story." I said, "Are you going to let me interview you properly this time?" She said, "I'll let you ask the real questions." I said, "What's the difference?" She looked at me. The corner of her mouth, the whole version, unheld. She said, "The real questions don't need a notebook." She went back to the bar. I sat at the window table in the April morning in the room built around the right things, with the best coffee in the city going slowly cold at my elbow because I had forgotten to drink it, and I thought, there is a long piece to write and a long time ahead in which to write it. There is a woman behind the bar who has been telling me the most important things in the only language she has ever known, and I am finally fluent enough to hear all of it. I picked up the coffee. I drank it. It was exactly right.